So you went on a podcast where they had another guest that was going to grill you.
Someone had really betrayed me. Someone who I thought was a good friend, somebody I trusted. Thousands of comments in our live videos, all negative, all derogatory, attacks on our own followers. And so then I got really upset and I made that video. And my whole team was counting on me to make a good response video. My wife and my kid were counting on me to make a good response video, and I failed. The creation story that comes into Genesis, literally almost word for word from the Enuma Elish.
You said that there were like verbatim parallels with the biblical creation story. I'm just curious, when you say that there are not just parallels, but there's actual copying, looking at Genesis chapter 1 and 2, where the creation story is summarized in the Bible, what are the actual kind of parallels there that you're looking to? As someone who's read both, I not only do I not find parallels, I actually, and this is the majority of ancient Near Eastern scholarship with me, think that Genesis chapter 1 is actually an apologetic against documents like the Enuma Elish.
Separated the waters from the waters, for example. That's in the Enuma Elish, and that's also in the biblical text. Take the Enuma Elish and put it into the biblical text. There's certain words that they utilize that let me know that they copied it from that text.
And the thing that really shocked scholars, like I said, this isn't true for all of the Dead Sea Scrolls, but one of the things that shocked them about Isaiah was that it was word for word identical to the Masoretic text.
Word for word?
Word for word.
Wow.
In the wake of Wes Huff, Billy Carson discussion, I had the privilege to sit down with Dr. Joshua Bowen, a bona fide Assyriologist and expert in the myths in ancient Sumerian and Akkadian, as well as skilled in Hebrew Bible and the Old Testament, to sort out the claims that were made by both sides. Is Genesis dependent upon or copied from ancient Mesopotamian texts like Gilgamesh epic or the Enuma Elish? Do the differences between the myths suggest that Genesis was not dependent on Enuma Elish? Or is there something much more important at play here? Did Wes really school Billy on the Old Testament? Or was Billy right when he critiqued the Hebrew Bible for being misogynistic, oppressive, and violent? More broadly, did Wes present what most scholars in the field say about the ancient Near East? Or did he cite scholars that actually aren't experts in these issues? Be sure to stay tuned until the end, where we critique how Wes and his Christian followers have failed to be like Christ in their engagement with Billy Carson. You don't want to miss it.
Who was slaves. I'm the God of Israel who brought you out of Egypt. So there's a fundamental difference, and there's lots of literature on this. I would encourage people to read my friend Paul Copan's book, Is God a Moral Monster? He's written some excellent stuff. He's also written on Did God Command Genocide in the Old Testament? He's a leading expert in the field of a comparative analysis of ancient Near Eastern war literature.
It's a red flag to me that Wes is citing Paul Copan as an expert in this. Okay, so he's an leading expert in the field of comparative analysis of ancient Near Eastern war literature. Right, okay. No, he's not.
Just to frame it for people, is Genesis dependent? This is the way I would like to describe this, because you're going to have the millions of viewers who aren't PhDs or even in the academic arena. And the real question is there any dependence? Is it borrowing, in a very simple sense, ideas from well-established, long mythos, long mythologies from Mesopotamia and who knows what other civilizations that may have had their hands in this, maybe even Egyptian to some degree?
If you're asking, is the Genesis, particularly the primeval history, Genesis 1 through 11, dependent upon earlier Mesopotamian mythological texts? The answer is unquestionably so. There's no doubt about it. And I think it seems that Wes, it's a little confusing and we'll talk about it, but it seems like in the beginning, Wes recognizes this. He makes a comment, as I think we're going to see, that this is the consensus, or this is, unquestionable or undebated, or not debated, that scholars they see, I think he means, he says Genesis 1 here, as an apologetic against the Enuma Elish. I thought he might have meant a polemic, but either way, if you're reacting to, if you're polemicizing a text, you're dependent upon it because you're reacting to it.
So let's keep rolling them, because I'm certain it's going to come out.
The Epic of Atrahasis as well is also there in the Old Testament. Several other tablets as well, Code upon Hammurabi and a few others have made it into that text. Sumerian cylinder scrolls that talk about the creation story. Again, the creation story in the Epic of Atrahasis. And so we tend to see this copying of ancient tablets, text, and scriptures, even some papyruses, into the biblical text.
So I would want to make sure in any conversation that I would have about this topic, I'd want clarity on what Billy Carson means by copy. Because I suspect what he means by that, particularly given what he says in the rest of the debate or the discussion, is that it's not written in a vacuum, right? It's not coming up with it. The Hebrew Bible isn't coming up with this stuff all on its own. It's not, I think he uses the phrase, it's not being written in real time. And that's absolutely the case, right? He's absolutely right about that. The problem is that when you use the word copy, it's like when you use the word plagiarize, right? Right? No one is going to, in the field, no one's going to use those terms, because when we think about copying, what comes to mind to particularly people in the field, but many people that are just listening, it's like, okay, I'm going to copy my neighbor's or my friend's homework. Right. So question 1, A. Question 2, B. Right. Yeah, like that's not what's happening. And I know that I've given this example here before, but here we go again. I think it's a good one. Eminem is not copying Joan Jett's I Love Rock and Roll in his song Remind Me. That doesn't mean that Eminem is not strongly dependent upon Joan Jett's song. I mean, he would tell you that. I mean, he goes out of his way to show you that. In fact, so much of his work, as with other rappers, are dependent upon, and that they count on you as the listener making these subtle connections to previous work, because this is what it means to create a new genre. It's taking something and reworking it in such a way that makes it new. And this is what's happening in Genesis 1. It's happening in Genesis 1 through 11. It's happening more widely in the Hebrew Bible. It's how they did it in ancient Near Eastern literature. And we can go into boring details about that if you like. But the reality here is that when Billy says that they're copying word for word or something like that, that's not the case, right? And I think, but I don't know that that's what he means.
So let me step in and give my little 2 cents of this, because I think, again, the average person, when they think copy, they think what you just described, dependent. Some do, and this is why it's important we're educating and getting your 2 cents from the academic arena to saying, okay, when you use the word copy, this is what we really mean by that in the strictest sense in academia. You're literally almost verbatim, and that was almost never done. Okay, that was almost never done with literature. You would have flunked in your thing if you were copying. You're always reworking. And so if we give a generous interpretation here to what Billy's saying, the dependent part comes in, and I think of René Girard and others who do mimetic theory in a philosophical linguistic sense, and they point out that everything is dependent on something else. The Hebrew Bible is not in a vacuum and did not start in a vacuum. It started working off and, as is pointed out by Wes, competing with other ideas. But how do you do that if you don't actually in some way are dependent on that framework in order to compete. And this is what I do with my comparative mythology stuff. And I get the association fallacy all the time. And it's like, well, it's really academics who are making the case that I think have convincing arguments, sometimes genetic, sometimes just general genre observations. But I think we continue because he gets into more of this. Your point, I think, is that, am I right?
Yes, it's if we're precise about the words that we're using, but this is why I brought up the ways, the vantage points from which we're coming to this.
I think that prove your point.
Yeah.
Your point is not like he is getting the gist you're pointing at, but it is important that we're correcting that so that the viewers know that like it isn't Xerox word for word, verbatim, just a rip off of the identical thing. But when look, for those who don't know, me and you, I reached out to Wes. I want to have a conversation post-debate to talk about what he felt was successful, to press him on some of the things that I disagreed with, but also to kind of understand his arguments and where he was coming from. He didn't have time for me. I don't want to get lost in the sauce of trying to get people to like either oppose, look, he doesn't want to come talk to you, or he's scared of you, none of that. I'm not trying to feed into that. I think he's a busy guy, and look, he's an apologist. I don't know if an apologist wants me on the top tier of people he's trying to visit, when my channel does a lot of anti-apologist stuff. So let's put that on the table. The other thing is I get accused of riding the wave. I'm riding Wes's wave. Let me just nip that just to say, you do know that Wes is riding Billy's wave, and Billy was riding Joe Rogan's wave, and I'm just making a point, like everybody is doing this conversation, and that ain't a gotcha. This needs to be addressed. It's a perfect time to educate, especially since everyone's looking and wanting to hear, what do scholars say? So that being said, you and I spoke to Billy, and in our interactions, that is exactly what he says he means.
Yeah. And I think that maybe using an example early on that makes it very clear in a non-contentious context for anybody that's listening of what this type of interaction is or was in the ancient world will be really useful going forward. And I've talked about it before. Actually, I think I talk about it in the course, the MVP course on myths borrowed by the Bible. And it is how this text, the Enuma Elish, utilizes an earlier myth called the Anzu myth. And just very, very quickly, the Anzu myth is a story about a giant mythological bird who is guarding the cella of one of the top gods, Enlil. And Enlil has this thing called the Tablet of Destinies, which is the coolest name ever. And the Tablet of Destinies is like the reality stone in the Avengers.
Yeah, with the guy,
That's right.
Yeah.
So it kind of controls nature, right? Kind of controls things in the world. So Enlil goes to take a bath, takes the Tablet of Destinies and puts it down. The Anzu bird takes it, flies off with it, and the whole world falls into chaos. And this god, Ninurta, has to go, or ultimately goes, has this major battle, 2 major battles, with the Anzu bird. And he can't beat him the first time, because every time they'd fight and he'd shoot an arrow, Ninurta would shoot an arrow at him, and the Anzu bird would take the Tablet of Destinies and say, essentially like, hey, wood that's in that arrow, turn back or go back to your thicket, right? And it would obey it, right? As it controls reality. And so Ninurta, this mighty warrior god, has to get help from Ea, Enki, on how to trick him, okay? And that's the basis. So he ultimately wins, but by tricking him. Now, that's the earlier mythology, the earlier text, and it's very well known. Enuma Elish pulls from some major sections, like the overarching, movement of the story in many respects is pulled from the Anzu myth. It's playing on it, right? And scholars, Assyriologists for years have, sort of referred to this as like, it's like the Anzu myth 2.0, right? Or Marduk, who is the protagonist of the story, the hero of the story, is the next story, right? He is like Ninurta revived, But the point here is that the Enuma Elish makes very clear references back to it. Like not disputed in the field at all, references back to the Anzu myth. So there's like, if we were to talk about dependency, if we were to talk about, is the Enuma Elish written in a vacuum or something, or is it written in real time? Or no, it's utilizing the Anzu myth. It's dependent upon the Anzu myth, and that was a good thing. And some of the ways that you can see this, and we can get into it in more detail as the clips go on, but you can see it in specific language that's being used. You can see it in themes that are being used. You can see it in, and as Wes points out, I mean, he's correct when he says this, that it's in the details. But the thing is, I don't think it works for Wes in this context. I think it actually works for Billy in this context, because it's in the details that we see this dependency and why it's dependent and how it utilizes it, which is really important to the Genesis narratives.
Before we proceed, that is something that has always come up with apologetics against what I do with comparative mythology. We find commonality. They go, that's generic. IP did this with me with wine, water into wine. Okay, I'm going to beat a dead horse here, but to make the point, go ahead and give me any god in the Mediterranean world. I'll give you a millennium, okay, to work with. Give me another god that transforms springs, rivers, fountains, empty jars with wine that intoxicates and enriches the people's lives as a god of nature, and is well known in mythology to grant immortality to his devotees post-mortem. Okay, and the list can go on and on about Dionysus and overlaps that we find within Christ. The point is, and I'm using Christ to mean Jesus. Jesus literally fills empty jars, right? He'll go, those are generic, general. How many other examples can you pull out of your you-know-what to prove that there's so many of those? There aren't, and that's why people like Rudolf Bultmann and other scholars go, listen, I tried to find a Jewish one. There's no Jewish example I could go to. The scholars like to go back to Jewish sources first to check. I don't blame them. The scriptures say it is written, right? And so they run there. There's nothing. What do we do now? Well, gotta go to Dionysus. And they do that, the ones that aren't trying to make some apologetic. It's those similarities become general or generic and insignificant. And I think that's the sleight of hand that Wes pulls, in my opinion, when we talk about dependence. And then when you find differences, they become the maximal. They are what makes it so distinct that it has no dependence. And that is the apologetic, I think. I don't like it. It annoys me that why are we saying both are significant? Similarities, at least great, we're dealing with the same topos. Differences is how we interpret this one versus the one before it.
Yeah, I mean, sort of the main example that you can pull out of the primeval history in Genesis is the flood narrative. And this is one that just scholars have known about it for centuries. And it's what we all talk about because it's just so clear. Atrahasis, Gilgamesh Tablet 11, even, the Sumerian, the flood stories that predate, like, there's no question that Genesis 6-9 is utilizing this flood story. But the interesting thing is not necessarily to look at where they line up. The interesting thing is to ask the question, why are they, where are they different? And what does that mean exactly? So, but this is how we do things. There is a type of literature called a city lament. And a city lament bridges different genres in Sumerian. And Steve Tinney wrote a wonderful piece on this in a monograph. But it makes a new genre. There's a type of city lament that it makes this new genre. And that's what they do. They take other genres and they mix them together. And you get like this thing in the middle, right, that brings it together. And so the question is, when we look at things that this looks like this, and the writer or writers are clearly trying to draw our attention back here, where is it that they're different? What are they saying that's distinct? And those are the things that are really interesting to look at. And that's why something like the Anzu myth, I'll just give one example. Yeah, very, very quickly, please. In the Anzu myth, Ninurta can't win because Anzu has the Tablet of Destinies. And everybody knows that. In the Enuma Elish, it's not Tiamat, the main sea goddess, who's the really, really powerful one that needs to be defeated. It's her like consort that's set up, Kingu. Kingu is set up, and she places the Tablet of Destinies like in his hands up against his chest, right? Here, this is like, you're in charge, right? I'm elevating you. And Kingu, having the Tablet of Destinies, having been placed in this position of preeminence, is defeated not by some great battle, but by simply Marduk approaching for battle.
That sets Marduk apart unbelievably compared to his previous myth.
Because everybody's thinking, well, I remember Ninurta had to like fight, and he couldn't win, so he had to use trickery. Marduk wins against it, but the Tablet of Destinies doesn't even help that god. That's how powerful Marduk is. And so, like, for somebody to say, look, the stories are completely different, right? Like, look, he doesn't even fight him, and here in this other one he does fight. It's like, yeah, that's the point.
It makes me think of sorry to keep rambling about this, but Job, when you do see Leviathan, which is this sea creature like a Tiamat that represents the chaotic waters, and he is getting cosmological. He is describing cosmology, and he's saying, I play with it like a bird. Like but then you go to Genesis 1 and you have a very demythologized form of a Leviathan battle kind of thing. It's so obvious.
And that's why when people say, well, look, there is no like, sea monster to defeat, right? There is no battle. Yeah. That's what's interesting about it. That's the point, is the priestly writer is creating this like, he's trying to argue for this transcendent deity. He does it. He's like Marduk. He doesn't even need to fight. And in fact, here, all he's got to do is speak, and which Marduk does, right? Marduk speaks, and the constellation comes in, or the constellation is destroyed, and he speaks again, and by the power of his word, the constellation comes back. Like this is what it's playing off of. But here for Yahweh, or for, in this case, Elohim, like, there isn't even a battle to be had. That's the differences are what are interesting and show this type of dependence.
That's what I found, that it's made it into the canonized Bible, but they never reference that they got it from any other ancient texts and tablets that have to do with a totally different civilization with totally different religious beliefs.
Yeah, have you read the Enuma Elish?
Yeah, I've done lectures.
Do you mind? Sure. Do you mind summarizing the content of the creation account in the Enuma Elish for us?
Yeah, this rubbed me the wrong way. And if I'm being charitable, like I would think, okay, can you summarize it for the audience so that we're all on the same page? Right. I don't want to overstep. You've read this text, could you summarize it for us so that we can, I don't want to overstep my bounds. But it's hard to think that that's what Westhoff was doing.
You're saying it sounds like he's trying to have a gotcha. We're setting him up to make errors, and when he does potentially make the errors, let me pick them apart or try to. It's a debate. Clearly, he's trying to play tactics. He's doing an Aya.
But that's wild. Like, but the problem here, I think, is this. So what, right? So let's say that Billy Carson comes back and goes, no, I can't. So what? Like, what does that prove? Because I don't think it proves much of anything. And this is really the problem here, that I hold academics in the field to a higher standard. I remember there was a debate that Schuyler Fiction had with someone whose name is escaping right now, but he's a PhD in philosophy. And he said to Schuyler, who is a non-specialist, and he's not a philosopher, they were talking about morality, and the philosopher PhD guy said, and I feel bad that I can't remember his name now, but he said, well, I'm not going to talk to you anymore unless you can put your arguments in syllogistic form. Now, however, it was definitely to shut him up, right? That's how it came across. Like, I'm going to make you look dumb, and I'm going to shut you up. Like, that's what the goal seemed to be for that scholar. And I did a response video to it because that really bothers me, because I think, first of all, it comes across as so elitist, right? And I think our roles, our role here as the people that are in the field, that are specialists, that have had the good fortune or opportunity to spend time in graduate school. I mean, I told you this before. I'm no smarter than the next guy. I just had the opportunity to get this training, right? There are people that are far more intelligent than I am. They just didn't have the opportunity to do it. So I think I have a responsibility, since I've had this opportunity to get this training, to try to make that available. And the way that you do it, I don't think, is to come to somebody who's an interested non-specialist, even if they have vastly different conclusions, ones that I wouldn't agree with, right? And to try to make them look stupid on the air. And that's how this came across to me.
I think if I'm going to stillman and even give some brownie points to Wes for just a moment, I can't say Wes specifically, but in general, I noticed the hype when everyone was doing the critique of Billy, that they were taking statements Billy had said on some really popular channels all over the internet, where he was like I'm a specialist on cylinders and scrolls, like I'm the leading world's expert, like he's like putting himself out there for this kind of potential fall.
I see.
But see, when you and I talked to Billy wasn't coming off with that ego or any of that. And I was like, well, it seemed like locker room talk, like, yeah, man, I'm one of the smarter, these kinds of things. Let's go ahead and say up front, we don't draw Billy's conclusions in terms of where he goes with the material. We're simply trying to address the very basic facts of dependency here and some of the things that were brought up in this debate. And I want to just nip another thing in the butt, is while the Christian will sit here and try to mock him into alien stuff or any of the things that Billy might actually discuss, they are also the same people who believe dead people are coming out of graves and all sorts of stuff. So like, there's no room, I think, to mock or scoff at people who have different kinds of beliefs. That's just, if you're going to have something that I can look at and go, hey, you don't have any room to talk, okay? We don't draw those conclusions, but we empathize with seeing what took place, and especially the aftermath of hearing how many death threats and the N-word being thrown around in private messages to him, and him telling us how he has never in his whole life ever had this many words from Christians writing him. Now, Christians will say, those aren't real Christians. Dude, there's a bandwagon of Christians that are doing this. I know I went off topic, but I just wanted to make that point that he has kind of set himself up as this person who knows this. Christians are offended by the fact that we're being critical of the Bible, or maybe we don't believe the Bible, and that includes Billy, about slavery, about dependence on this other stuff. So they need a warrior, they need a Heracles to fight their battle, they need an Inerta, they need a Marduk to come in and try to destroy the Tiamat. And right now, Tiamat to them is Billy. And so they're taking those clips and Billy's coming in doing this. But your point is, just so I'm still manning you, is that as a scholar, there should be a little bit more, maybe instead of trying to gotcha, make this a point of an educational moment, because this didn't turn out into just an educational moment. This became we're going to publish this anyway, in light of someone whose feelings was really upset about the fact that y'all were still going to proceed with this. Wasn't at his best, he said. Didn't want this stuff to go public, and you still did it. There's parades of chaos on the internet now. I mean, like these kinds of things. There's probably a better way that it could have gone.
Well, I think I think maybe there's a way that we can look at this that will make it a little bit clearer, at least what's going on in my mind. First, if Billy had come in here and said, I know Akkadian, right? Or I know Sumerian, and I've, I'm telling you that this Akkadian word means this. I think it would be perfectly fair, perfectly reasonable, and like something I would say, like, okay, so you've been trained in Akkadian then, so can you giving a little, I don't know, I still think giving a little field test like this is, I don't know, I just don't know how far it gets you, because, I think I could say to a lot of Christians, summarize the book of Job, right? Or can you tell me the story of Samson, right? Or walk me through the conquest, or walk me through the whole Exodus story. That one might be a little bit easier, but even so, like, I feel like it might be difficult for somebody to walk through some of those stories if they haven't read them recently, right? But I don't know that I could then come back and say, you don't really know this stuff. The other problem here is that what Billy's saying about dependency, about Genesis 1 being dependent upon the Enum Elish is not terribly debated.
Right.
And it seems like Wes knows that, because if I understood what Wes said, like he agreed that it's an apologetic was the word that he used.
Right.
Whether he meant that or polemic, whatever. So that's not contentious. And so I don't know, this just, it came across in the wrong way to me. And if Billy had said something, again, like, yeah, I'm an expert in the Akkadian language, and so I know that's, and he was coming up with something that wasn't agreed upon by the majority of specialists in the field about that, then yes, pushing back on that, I think, but I still think there's a way to do it. But it probably wouldn't have rubbed me the wrong way. But here, this one kind of did.
I think my takeaway, and it's going to continue into the next clip, but the takeaway for me was, and I think what bothers you and me was this became a W to Wes in his mind during this discussion. And again, we're back to this. Is Wes admitting that it's dependent? It's like he's saying, sure, but no. In a weird way, that's how I feel his viewers, all the audience was taking it as a W in this. Like, they see it and they go, Genesis isn't dependent on any of these earlier myths.
Yeah, I think that Wes, for the first half of what we're going to see here, at least the first section of it, I think you feel like he's very careful about what he says, and through a lot of what he says, I think he's very careful to distinguish between like what is the biblical, what do the biblical texts say, and what does historical Christianity teach. Like, I think that's good, right? I think that's being very careful about what interpretive framework one is utilizing. But I feel like here you're right on that. He says, and we should just get to the clip, but like he says, yeah, it's dependent, but then at the end you feel like he's saying, no, it's not.
Sure. The Enum Elish is a very ancient text discovered in the library of Ashurbanipal. And the summary of it is that it really gives us an account, which is crazy, an astronomical account of the creation of our solar system. It talks about planets and moons gaining specific orbits around the sun. It talks about a huge planet named Tiamat, 46 times larger than Earth. Earth didn't exist at the time, according to the author of this text, which is pretty interesting. And then there talks about a nemesis of sorts. In the original version, it's called Nibiru, but in a more recent version, still thousands of years old, the name was changed to Marduk. Marduk is in the Jewish American Library, in the biblical text, in the Torah, and so forth. Very popular figure in ancient times in the religious books and texts. Marduk wanted to be the destroyer, so Marduk is the one that during its next orbit towards Tiamat, crashed into Tiamat and destroyed Tiamat. A huge chunk of it swung away, recoalesced, taking the water, land, and organic material, which basically recoalesced as our planet here, Earth.
He asked him to summarize, and clearly his interpretation would not completely align with what your interpretation would be on this. He's probably working from translations, not saying he doesn't possibly pull up in a lexicon that might have a word for word here, but in terms of reading it as an expert, I don't think Billy's ever claimed to be an expert in reading these languages. But again, he wanted him to give me the rundown, and there's a lot more we didn't play that he gives about these earlier myths, because I think he was waiting for him to make mistakes so that you could just pick them apart. But
when I listen to this, I mean, obviously, and you and I have said this to Billy,
yeah,
like we obviously don't agree with like the ultimate conclusions that are drawn from the data points. But again, what we're doing here is trying to say, let's start with the data points.
Right.
And then we're talking about the data points. I think Billy got a lot of these things correct, right? When it comes to things like dependency.
We would disagree about Tiamat being a planet, just to point out a few differences. Tiamat being a planet, or I think there was a comment about Nibiru and something to this effect.
Well, I think what I would say is that if you were to ask an evangelical Christian today, like if we were to ask, can you tell me the story of the Garden of Eden? And you would probably, or you very well may hear them say, well, this is the story about the fall of man and how sin entered the world, and it started either you get the first gospel message in Genesis 3:15,
Right.
and this is where Satan tempts Eve, and this is following the fall from heaven. Well, okay.
Ask an Orthodox Jew to explain what the Garden of Eden is. Radically different, very, very different.
But the evangelical Christian is coming at the text through their interpretive lens. And it sounds like that's what Billy's doing here, right? So Billy seems to be adopting like an allegorical approach to the text, it seems like.
Or from some have commented, and I don't know how factual this is, something to do with like a Zecharia Sitchin kind of, it's like blending modern planets and stuff and then trying to kind of explain in a way, allegorically, I guess you could say, these ancient gods and stuff in some there. I don't know.
Yeah, and I mean, without talking extensively to Billy about this, like I don't know how I would know, but you're like listening to one of the things that he said, for example, is that the Tiamat, part of Tiamat, it's like, I think he said, like, it's thrown up into the heavens and it creates I think he said it creates, I can't remember, creates the planets or creates the Earth, part of it creates Earth, the other half went back to the asteroid belt, I think is what he said. Well, I mean, this seems like what he's referencing is when Marduk defeats Tiamat, right? Surrounds her with his net and then blows this evil wind into her mouth, it fills up her belly and shoots the arrow in, and then ultimately cuts her in half like a fish, the text says, and takes half of her carcass and stretches it out amongst the heavens, right? Well, if he's reading that and saying this is actually representative of a planet coming in and smacking another planet or something,
I think that's what he is doing.
that sounds like an allegorical approach.
Okay.
But maybe he's just viewing this as this is what they saw and this is how they tried to represent it. In any case,
Either way.
That's taking the data points. What do these Akkadians word mean? The words say. What is the syntax and what does the text actually say in its as we would translate it? And then taking an interpretive framework and saying, well, I think this is them trying to represent actual events that took place in history. Well, that's an interpretive framework. It's one that I wouldn't agree with. But that's what his summary is doing. So if I'm listening to an evangelical Christian tell me about Genesis 3 or the Garden of Eden story, I don't sit there and say, it's not Satan, right? Because unless it's a very specific circumstance, because what I'm doing is I'm understanding that they're coming at that text through their interpretive lens. So what they're going to say is that's Satan in the garden.
Right.
And I understand that, and so I sort of grant that along. And it sounds like that's what Wes did, if I'm remembering right.
It seemed that way toward the end of it. And even then, Billy, even a few moments where he's like, this is my personal opinion.
Sure.
The genetic modification of hominids and stuff, like he's trying to blend things to make it make sense. But yeah.
But it does sound like he's familiar enough with the text that he's talking about some like pretty major sections of it, right? And this is the problem, I think, for me, and I'm not saying that I wouldn't be guilty of doing this in a particular circumstance as well, but I would critique myself for having done it. I mean, it sounds like this is a gotcha moment. And like if you haven't read the Gilgamesh epic in a while, try to summarize it. It's a very complicated text.
Yeah. You'll get this, not the right order.
There are lots of movements in it. So but I would be very happy to say, like, yeah, there's probably some really clear parallels between Gilgamesh Tablet 11 and Genesis 6 through 9. So, but if you were to say, I don't think can you summarize the Gilgamesh epic for me? like, I mean, I've got to rap about it. So, like maybe I'd be able to do that, a little bit better. But I mean, like the reality here is it's complicated text. So I'd be like, okay, so it starts off with this.
Yeah, but you being a specialist, you're going to get in the weeds about stuff that where if you ask, right, like, is a king, he's being a tyrant, he's being an asshole, he's taking advantage of women, the gods don't like it, there's a conversation, there's prayers coming up, and he sends a dude he creates who's in the woods, who's like a nature man, who's as strong almost as him. He falls in love with the guy after they fight, but first, before he becomes human, see, I already got the order off, there's a prostitute who comes and like tames him and makes him, like, I'm trying, and I'm not an expert, but like, you see, I'm going to say things.
It's not, I don't think it's indicative of whether Billy knows this story or not.
Right.
Or if he's read this story or not. I think we all do this, and I'll shut up, but I think we do this. People feel very comfortable, as they should, saying, I think, scholars would say that, the Exodus as it's laid out in the Bible didn't really happen.
Right.
If a non-specialist said that, and then an Egyptologist came up to them who does think that it happened and said, can you even tell me walk me through the Exodus story and the wanderings and the conquest. Go ahead, tell me the story. If they were like, like that they were in Egypt and there was like the Pharaoh, and I don't remember the order of the plagues or anything, but like then they left at the Red Sea and they like wandered around for a while, and like that wouldn't be indicative of any way that like they didn't know the story, or they didn't know the archaeology, or they hadn't like read it before, right? And come to a conclusion. We do this all where we come to a conclusion about something and we kind of like put it on the shelf.
Yeah.
A lot of stories there, parallel stories that you see in the Bible, even the Tower of Babel incident and many other crazy stories that are in the Bible. You can find a lot of those true stories in the ancient text, like the Epic of Gilgamesh, where you can find the true story of Noah. They found the Noah tablet to give him instructions on how to build the ark. It wasn't a big boat. It was a round disc that he built with sections cut up on the inside like a pie. That was discovered about 4 or 5 years ago. I believe it's at the British Museum now. So there's a lot of text that's just been covered and copied over into the biblical text.
Yeah, and here is a good example, right? Like, I would not obviously agree with the words that Billy's using here, right? Like, when he says that this is the true version.
I caught that, yeah.
But I would also think, having this conversation, what does he mean by that? What's he trying to relay to me? Because true to me, like, as this sort of philosophical notion, okay, this is the one that actually happened or something. Yeah, I don't think that's what he means by that. And I would assume the best in this conversation and say, okay, I mean, I would hope that I would. And say, okay, probably what he means by that is like the more original, the earlier.
That is an interpretation. You could take it as he in some way thinks this one is closer to what actually happened or something. I don't know.
Yeah.
You and I would obviously think this is mythology. And at best, again, if we wanted to go down the memory lane and say, well, look, the Euphrates flooded often, and so someone had a boat and floated. But who knows? You know what I mean? But yeah, I like your point about older. And it's clear the Bible is, we've pointed out, like in the academics, we're going to get into some of the details here, is dependent on the older stories. This is an older story. It brings me to the whole point of when Billy was like, some people think this is real time acted.
Meaning that my point here is that I think a lot of people are saying that this information was written in real time. A lot of people believe that. If you ask the average person, they really believe that. But a lot of this information is just copied from older tablets and texts from an earlier date.
That's because I have had, and you had a different interaction, where Christians are screaming through my comment section, Abraham was in Mesopotamia. He is the one who had these stories because he lived it. He was there. So all these stories from Gilgamesh, Tablet 11, from Atrahasis and the Enuma Elish and all these myths, they're all after Abraham, and therefore all the diluted demonic versions of the Abraham, which was older and original. Do you see what I'm saying? And it's like, oh my gosh, you have to break that down.
Yeah, I mean, I'm super excited to see the evidence. Like, that's what I would say to that.
But you have a tablet, dates to the 3rd millennium BCE, and you have a text that talks about a character that supposedly stretches back to what, the second millennium BC, doesn't even go older than the oldest tablets we have about some of these myths. You see what I'm saying? I mean, look, this isn't the way that research is done. It says that how scholars in the field draw conclusions about these things. You can't start with, we think this is an inspired, infallible text that was given by God, right? And then move from there. That unfortunately doesn't work that way. And so you have to ask questions like, okay, what are the data points? What do we have? Right? And when you look at what we have, starting around the beginning of the second millennium BCE, early in the second millennium, like we have this flood story developing. And it develops in Akkadian, it develops in Sumerian, and it comes down in a pretty rich tradition through the Epic of Gilgamesh, through Atrahasis. And, when you couple that with Israel's not a thing until the earliest that we know of Israel is 1207 with the Merneptah's tale. And, through Iron One, they're developing in the highlands. We you can't just say, oh, even though we don't have any evidence of it, we think that some guy named Abraham passed on this tradition in a way that, I don't know, went through different languages and yet still come away saying, all right, well, we have this Akkadian term in this particular context of a flood that shows up in the Hebrew Bible. When the Hebrew Bible Hebrew has a perfectly good word to describe this, or to indicate this, and yet uses this term that isn't used elsewhere. Like there are these clear linguistic connections, and even just in the flood story, and yet, what are you supposed to think? Like this tradition just passed down with these little specific things. Like you have to make an argument for that. Right? You can't just assume it. This is a really good point.
I'm just curious, when you say that there are not just parallels, but there's actual copying, looking at Genesis chapter 1 and 2, where the creation story is summarized in the Bible, what are the actual kind of parallels there that you're looking to? Because as someone who's read both, I not only do I not find parallels, I actually, and this is the majority of ancient Near Eastern scholarship with me, think that Genesis chapter 1 is actually an apologetic against documents like the Enuma Elish. So what are the parallels there?
Yeah, see, this is where, like, I agree with Wes, right? In the sense that I think the majority of scholars look at Genesis 1 as some type of reaction to either the Enuma Elish or some derivation of it.
So, but then why is that whole sentence of, I don't find any parallels, he said, but all of ancient Near East will agree with me. This is an apologetic or a polemic against. So I don't know how you can't find parallels. So that tells me, and this is my reading, I may not be so generous here, but I'm just being honest. I found it over and over in the school of apologetic thought that I know the people that Wes runs with, they may not be PhDs themselves. These are people like Inspiring Philosophy and others. And he's commented on this stuff too, trying to divorce Genesis. This is a known apologetic trend to divorce it from having parallel dependence on these earlier myths. And they'll have a clever way of going, no, this scholar doesn't think, Joel Baden doesn't think, direct this to that. Therefore, Joel Baden thinks that it's not reactionary to the mythos, and Joel Baden doesn't think it's mythology. I mean, what do you mean by this? It's like people who quote a scholar that I know for a point and then disagree with everything else they say about it, but just need that thing to get their point on their side.
Yep.
And this was contradictory sounding to me.
Yes.
It's parallel, but it's polemic, and it's not parallel. Sorry, it's not parallel, but it's a polemic.
Yeah, and that's why it's confusing to me, because you can't in the same way or at the same time say, again, that Eminem is riffing off of, if that's the word you use there, off of Joan Jett's I Love Rock and Roll, and yet say there are no parallels between them. Like one requires the other.
Right.
And so, because it doesn't work otherwise, right? Oh brother, where art thou?
Yeah.
If you've seen Oh brother, where art thou? Like they say, like that there are very clear signs in the story that they're trying to pull from the Odyssey, right?
Yep.
Now they get some weird stuff wrong, seemingly, but nonetheless, like if somebody were to say, if Billy were to come in and say there's dependency of Oh brother, where art thou on Homer's Odyssey, like I don't think anybody'd have a problem with that, right? Nobody would say, well, now look, here, the sirens in Oh brother, where art thou get the travelers, right? They get them, and the sirens didn't get them in the Odyssey. So, well, I mean, yeah, this is just, sirens are just something that show up in all kinds of texts, right?
No, when we're hitting something so important that I fight this every day with apologists. It just doesn't click. It doesn't seem, because they need it to not be, they don't want it to be in the same category. They don't want it to potentially be in the same category. So they try to distance it, and then they also have a superior explanation for why this one is the true and the one, and none of the other ones are true. There's so much going on there.
Yeah. And I just don't think it's necessary. Ancient Near Eastern scholars that are evangelicals are very clear that in the ancient Near East and in the Hebrew Bible, they had a different view of the world, right? They had a different cosmology than we do today. So they viewed the earth as flat, and they are the dome overhead, right? Like foundation pillars. Like they didn't think about the world in the same way that we do. And that's not a problem for them. They just say that God is utilizing where man was at the time to tell a story through this particular genre. And you don't have to read it like literally. That's how they engage with it. Now, like, do I ultimately agree with the things how their ultimate conclusions? No. But the point is that I don't think it's necessary to create this gulf between them. I think when you recognize that Genesis 6 through 9 is a polemic on the Mesopotamian traditions, when you recognize that Genesis 1 through 11 is a polemic on Mesopotamian traditions about the city and the focus on the city and movement toward the city, it makes it that much more meaningful. And I think what it means is you might have to walk away from your interpretive framework a little bit and say, all right, I'm not going to read this in the same literalistic fashion in order to derive meaning from it. And so this, I feel like I need some more clarity on this, because I don't understand what Wes is saying when he's saying it's both an apologetic or a polemic, whichever one he meant, and yet there are no parallels. I don't understand it.
Separated the waters from the waters, for example. That's in the Enuma Elish, and that's also in the biblical text.
Okay, that I would agree is a parallel. The only reason I highlight that is that if you're making this the argument, because if you brought it up, and I mean this with all due respect, there are superficial parallels. I would agree. The separation of the water, the concept of the earth being formless and void. That's also in the Enuma Elish. However, I think all the other details, it's the details that make the difference. And if we're looking at not the superficial crossovers, but the actual themes and concepts of what it's saying, you don't have a creation within 7 days.
I'm not going to take the Enuma Elish and put it into the biblical text. There are certain words that they utilize that let me know that they copied it from that text. Like, for example,
so what words?
Separating the water from the waters, the void, the earth being void. That information is literally just copied over. So it tells you that somebody saw that and said, let me add it to this book right here. Or let me add it to the scripture or this papyrus, because it wasn't a book yet at that time.
Was this text discovered that makes it parallel to Genesis? Was this like supposedly discovered prior to I'm just curious.
It wasn't discovered prior to the Bible, but it dates back long before the Bible was ever written.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
So let me just say this. So the reason why I say it's actually an apologetic against that is because the purpose of the Enuma Elish, which the Babylonians read every Babylonian New Year, was to point out the fact that the deities, and there's countless deities in the Babylonian pantheon, they actually come from the created order. So they're not outside of time and space. They actually come from the created order. And when they die in this battle, right, when Tiamat is defeated, the defeated gods become the earth and the sky and the plants and even you and me. And in that sense, the theme is that you don't actually have any purpose or end result, and you're not created in the image of God. In fact, in the ancient Babylonian system, only the kings were created in the image of God. And what we see that is counter to that is that even, sure, there's superficial, divided the waters, but we find that in almost every society and culture. That's not a parallel as much as it's just a generality. I would say what we see within the biblical account is that God purposefully creates. There's only one God. He purposefully creates, and then he creates and it's good. And it continues to say it's good 7 times. And then at the end of chapter 1, just for, the thick people in the original audience, it says, and then it was very good. And then he creates humanity, not kings, but simply the humans that he creates in God's image.
I have so much I could say, and I know you have so much you could say. Would you like for me to take the first step or the easel two? Okay. Wes really unburdened a lot there, and I could have cut that into several clips, but I decided to keep it in one long one. And I think, again, if you're reading an English translation of either one of these, the concept is going to be conveyed that waters are separated from waters, period. You don't even need to know that the language is verbatim in order to get the concept. I'm trying not to be so polemical toward Wes because I see the agenda of apologetic that you see at the end of that clip. But I'm also trying to say, sure, splitting waters from waters is a general theme amongst these myths. It is a general motif. But you have to ask yourself, why is this a general motif? I would argue the reason is they're all stemming, likely at least, these ones that describe this particular event are likely in somehow, maybe genetically, going back to some of these myths that come from these major civilizations like Mesopotamia. Because the Nile flood myth is radically different in the way it's portrayed in Egypt than it is in Mesopotamia. So we're not trying to say they're all the same myth, but yes, if you look at Deucalion, you're going to get a Mesopotamian kind of spin. Deucalion is an influence from the East coming from these myths, and they are circulating these flood myths into different cultures and different settings and different mythos. But that tells me that there is a likely connection, and some of the elements make me connect them together. They're somehow relatable. They're related. It's the differences, I agree with Wes, that give it the unique spin, and that was his ultimate agenda. Is there anything I missed that you wanted to capitalize on in that?
Well, I mean, again, there are several things that I'd like to say. Hopefully I can remember them. Asking for specific things, like specific words, in a conversation that seems to be very general to me. Now, I could be completely misreading this, but this feels like, and I feel like they said it a couple of times, like a conversation, everybody's laid back. Like it seemed like that was supposed to be the tone here, maybe. And to say to someone, what are the specific parallels? Clearly to somebody who hasn't recently prepared for this. I mean, it doesn't seem like Billy's recently prepared for this. I could be wrong, but it doesn't seem like it. So then he gives him one. And he says, well, what are the specific words?
I want to can I just make a point about that? Wes doesn't know this language. So I'm not trying to put the mindset of Wes was trying to get into the Akkadian or was able to even fact check it. This is something you could do. But they're both going to work off English translations. You see what I'm saying?
I mean, maybe Wes knows Akkadian. I don't know.
But I guess you're Akkadian friend about her.
Yeah. But I think So for me, like trying to I've written a chapter on this. I took a course on it, for MVP courses. Like I've gone through this in some detail, right? And there are certain things that I can pull from. And I have MS, so I have like somewhat of a disadvantage when it comes to memory. But still, like I will go back and read my chapter and go, oh yeah, right, I forgot about that one. Oh yeah, like there's this, the word for skater to open, when it talks about like the sluice gates that open up. Like it's a term that seems to be being pulled from the Akkadian, right? So, but the word for pitch, right? That's one. And
And you said some of these words, they could have used a different word to describe it. They chose that particular word, which has its root comes from the Akkadian, which indicates dependence, of course, on earlier myth.
it seems again like when you hear, in Eminem's song, "I love you," when the "I love" is Joan Jett's voice, right? It's those things that make it very, very clear to the listener, this is coming from "I love rock and roll," right? And the point that I'm trying to make with that is that if you take the primeval history more broadly, and you look at the flood story, or you look at what's going on in the city of Babel story, not the Tower of Babel story, the city of Babel story, there's very clear movement. And that's not even to mention like what's going on in Genesis 1 or what's going on in Genesis 2 and 3. And their connections to things like Adapa or Gilgamesh, tied a little up with the missed opportunity at immortality. There is, like, you can see it throughout the primeval history that there's this multiplicity of connections, these points of connection, not just in specific linguistic terms, but more broadly.
Which is why some argue a not necessarily direct borrowing from Enuma-Elish or even Gilgamesh tablet. They think there could potentially be variations of it that go down. We just don't have them.
Sure. And so let me say this. There is an edited volume by Zioni Zavid, and it's called Subtle Citation and Illusion, something like that. Right. And Joel Bailey's got an article in it, and it's a phenomenal little volume. But it's all about how scholars deal with this topic in particular. How is it that we see intertextuality, texts that are playing with each other and dependent upon each other? And when we see things like some of the terms that are used are an echo or an allusion to something or a blind motif, like these are all different things that you can see from a source text and a receptor text, and they all have different levels of indicating dependency. So, like, you can't just say, we're going to look at the differences in Genesis 1 on like the image of God and say, well, that's different from what you see in Mesopotamia, but then there is no dependency. Because if you did that, if I could do that, then I could go to Genesis 6 and I could say, all right, look, why was there a flood? Well, Genesis 6 clearly tells me that mankind had become uber wicked. Terrible, 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 terrible. And Yahweh was grieved, and it was the right thing. It's the only option he had, really. Like, Yahweh was just and righteous in destroying humanity. That's completely different from what you see in the Mesopotamian flood traditions. Enlil is called wicked. He's called evil, this evil thing that he does for sending the flood. And Ea has to come along and rescue humanity over and over again. Like, so they can't be parallel. They can't be dependent because those two things are completely different. Well, no, it doesn't work that way. It's those distinctions become meaningful in light of the other connections that draw the text together. Right?
That's the important, like in that context, you have the antagonist, Noah himself, who is sacrificing post-flood, and the God has a change of heart in both stories where they promise to never destroy by flood again. Both gods. God in the Bible seems like he smells the aroma of the sacrifices like, well, we're not doing that again. And of course, in the earlier flood myths, I heard there's different ones. I was reading where there's one where he is flooding for, and this is in the earlier, somewhere in one of these myths, he is flooding them for wickedness, that they were being wicked. It wasn't just for being loud.
So there's a debate about what rigmar means. They also have the Circadian word. Yeah, but
Anyway, that's a whole different discussion.
Does it mean noise? Does it have indication of wickedness or something? And people have argued that.
I also want to take this one moment to just mention some little offshoot of a myth that is found in Dionysus with Orphism. And this is like, I think this may come from a much earlier period where in the myth of Dionysus, he's a little infant. The Titans scheme and decide, I'm going to go get this son of Zeus. And they eat him. They rip him into pieces and eat him. It's a gruesome myth, okay? Zeus is not happy. Thunderbolts out, going full gangster on these assholes for what they did to his son. Well, when he does, ashes cover the earth. It's a complete apocalypse. He completely annihilates the Titans who have consumed his divine son. The ashes that cover the earth end up, humans come out of the earth. And in this myth, humans that do good have a part of Dionysus in them. And the humans who behave bad are acting like the Titans. So in this kind of mythos, it's like, you know, you could almost look at it like that earlier mythos. You can see how the evolution of this idea of the good and the bad behaving humans are actually just imitating when the decayed, defeated evil gods or even good is mixed in there, that the way the humans who are made from earth, from clay, behave reflect either Tiamat or, I'm just making up an example here that I can see that evolution taking place in Orphic thought. Now, I wonder if that has any interpretation in the ancient Mesopotamians. I don't know. Like, that's not my area. This isn't my area, but I read this recently, so I'm just telling you like an interesting thing. What I saw Wes do was go, image of God. We're special. This is only for kings. And then I read about scholarship that talks about these genealogies that are Sumerian kings lists, that the genealogies in the biblical account are clearly kind of riffing off of in how they're crafting their genealogies. Yeah, they're not all kings, but they situate these characters in a genealogy like kings, but they aren't kings. Like
The confusion to me is it seems like we're arguing about two different, not you and I, but in this discussion, it seems like we're floating between two different things. Wes seems to be on the one hand saying, yeah, it's an apologetic against it. But let me say it this way. It sounds like what Billy is saying is the Hebrew Bible or the Genesis stories or whatever were not just made up by Moses or something, right? They're not just written out of nowhere, handed down from God or whatever. They're utilizing ancient mythologies. They're dependent upon them. They're borrowing from them, whatever. And it sounds like what Wes is trying to say is that the Genesis stories are not the same. They're special.
Right.
And both of those things can be true, right? I'd say both of those things are true.
So, in this, I think the Enuma is special. Of course, I think that Gilgamesh is special. But again, is this subjective? But it comes from the faith perspective. I think the Bible is special, and I don't believe it to be true. It's unique. It's got special things. That's right. Yeah. So we're talking past each other, I feel. One has the agenda of making it true, but it is the truth. He's wanting everyone to become what he is and believe what he believes. Whereas Billy is saying, look, man, this is another variation of mythology. And of course, Billy's going to highlight some things about the Bible that Wes does not like.
Yeah.
Slavery. We got to get into that.
Yeah.
Did you want to add anything to that before we continue?
I think in the end, the danger that we get into here. Now, go ahead. Sorry.
You feel free to express yourself, because I do feel, even on the image of God thing, I can go to Plato. This is backwards to me, because if these are priestly writers, like the scholar seems to indicate, post-exile, sometime Babylon or later, likely 5th, maybe even late Persian. For all we know, it could be a late thing. I have some scholars who even think early Hellenistic, these sections of Genesis, right? Who knows? At the end of the day, Plato has an idea that all mankind has this kind of concept. It's like all of us play a role. Now, some have the spark and some seem to not have it, but we're all kind of unique and special. Back then, it was kings. And I wanted to call Kara Cooney, we never did before this episode, to talk about this, because she points out that only the kings were made in the image of, or became like Osiris when they died. And they were uniquely in a place in their mythos to become like the god king Osiris, and they're like Horus and all this kind of stuff. Later on in Egypt, it becomes everyone can become Osiris. Everyone is.
This is the other thing that is very vexing to me about this notion. The biblical texts are relatively late. So when we do these comparisons to, like, he's going to talk about it, like the Code of Hammurabi. Right? Code of Hammurabi is in it's the first quarter of the 2nd millennium BCE. Let's assume everything that he says about it is true, that the laws in the Hebrew Bible about slavery, as we're going to talk about later, are like way, way better. They're not. But let's just assume it's true. It's 1,000 years later.
Like you would hope.
Theologies develop, like moral systems develop, like people develop. And if you were to look at Mesopotamian theology, Torkel Jakobsen has I think an article on this, but he talks about this, might be in his book, I can't remember off the top of my head, but he talks about how, I think it was Jakobsen. Sorry, it's been a while.
Okay.
But he talks about his view on how theology developed about deities in the 4th millennium, 3rd millennium, 2nd millennium, and so on. And you see this development, or it's at the 3rd, 2nd, and 1st millennium, I think. But you see this development from, like, the god is mostly equated or more equated with, like, the actual natural phenomenon. So, like, the sun, that's a god, right? Or the storm, that's a god. And then it develops into, well, gods are more human-like. They're like kings, right? And by the time you get down into the 1st millennium, like, you have a lot of personal deities, right? So, what kind of a flex would it be for, somebody in the 1st millennium be like, look, they think that the gods, like, are personal. Yeah, but back those people thought they were just like the sun. Like, and again, that's a very evolutionary model, and I'm not saying that everybody or even most people would subscribe to it. But the point is that theologies develop, people's ways of thinking develop, and if we're going to do this type of comparison, like, you got to take it forward. So with the image of God, what I'd want to ask is, therefore what? So, like, okay, let's assume for a second that Egypt doesn't democratize the image of God to just regular people. Let's assume that. Let's assume there's only in the Hebrew Bible. What does that mean? Because what I've heard apologists say in this regard is that, like, there's this really high value. Everybody is equal. Everybody is created in God's image, and therefore there's, like, equality, and, like, we're all on the same level. And in fact, I think Wes gets into some of this. So in Exodus 21:32, you have a slave. If he is gored by an ox that is known to gore, and the owner he's been negligent and he hasn't taken the right precautions to keep that done, and it gores a slave, the punishment is different than if it gores a free person. If it gores a free person, the owner's life is forfeit.
So how is the image of God equal how are we all equal, made in the image of God?
Unless we're a slave, I guess, because if we're gored and we're a slave, well, it's only 30 shekels of silver that's paid to the owner of that slave.
So your image of God can be lesser image of God than other images of God. I mean, do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, these are the hurdles that I think the apologist has to get over. And in other words, I think there's a lot of baggage that comes along with the idea of the image of God that comes from later Christian thought. And if we're just looking at it in that theological lens, fine. But the thing is, you're making an argument here, based on ancient text that doesn't assume.
You're theologizing when we're dealing with this historical data back here, and we're saying, hey, you think it's Satan, we got to differ. That's right. Saying it's original context. That's right. You think those are prophecies fulfilled, Isaiah 7:14. That's right. Read the original context. It's not talking about Jesus. This is the point. Look, let us make man in our own image, right? It's one God, and it's outside space and time, he said, right? Which is like the created order. These are part of the created order. These aren't. Plato. Read Plato, dude. Go read some of the contemporaneous around the 5th, 4th century BCE materials from the gods and the philosophers and the thinkers. And now go read Genesis again in light of that and go, maybe mine's not as unique. Well, I mean, I almost thought about this too. Here's a parallel, right? God spoke. Through power of speech, things happen, appear, things separate. Well, I did not know this, and I came across this while crafting a video. You already knew this, but I didn't ask you because there wasn't a topic we had been talking about. I was like, man, that's a unique thing. Well, I know now that Egyptian gods did that. They spoke, Ptah and others spoke. But in Mesopotamia, Marduk is tested in one of these stories. I don't know what the story is. Hey, you probably have better,
Yes. So just so that everybody knows, part of the main focus, I think, against what Wes implied, of the Enuma Elish is not to show that mankind has no purpose or something. I don't even know where he gets.
I think he's minimized it. I do think he's trying to downplay how the older myths don't really give a hoot about humanity. That we're almost like just slaves made for, you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, the whole point of the Enuma Elish is that Marduk gains ascendancy over the divine pantheon, right? He gets the ascendancy over the other gods, even those that are his forebears. So and he demands this. He says, look, if I'm going to defeat Tiamat, like Anu and Ea before me have been too afraid to do and unable to do, I want something for that. So you're going to make me head of all what I pronounce, that's going to be. And the way that the gods indicate this to him is they say, all right, look, we pronounce it, what you say will happen. So here, there's a constellation. Okay. Speak and it will be destroyed. Speak again and it will reform. It'll come back into existence.
Right.
And this is not a new thing. The Sumerian lamentational corpus that I wrote my dissertation on, the god Enlil, his word is a thing, right? There's a text that has that in its title, right? His word is a whale. His word is a whale. But the spoken pronouncement of deities is a thing. And so, here in the Enuma Elish, this text that we're trying to distance right from Genesis, here it is. So, I don't think that the image of God carries the weight that Wes is trying to imply, maybe that it does, in demarcating the text so much that there's no dependence.
And they have purpose and meaning, and that instills them with this creation order. And that's not what we find in the Enuma Elish. In fact, we find the opposite in the Enuma Elish, is that the created order is not good, it's a mistake, and that you are not created in the image of God. And there's a reminder that regular people are not created in the image of God. So linguistically, Hebrew does have Semitic ties with Akkadian. It doesn't with Sumerian. Sumerian is a language isolate, a glutinizing language. But I would say, just with all due respect, the parallels linguistically are not there. There might be superficial kind of concepts that are there, but they're so superficial that we can find them in everything, in the sense of I I'm in my office studio, you're in your office studio. That doesn't mean that, that we're the same people or we're even in the same place. Does that make sense?
So there are two things here that I would want to ask for some clarity on, because I'm not trying to understand where he's going with this. First, this idea that there is no created order in the Enuma Elish and that creation is a mistake.
Yeah, I was wondering about that.
So the story, just so that maybe the audience understands, the story starts off with Tiamat and Apsu, these two saltwater, freshwater deities. And they're mingling their waters together. And it says, before anything had been formed, like the meadowlands and the cane brakes and all this stuff, the reed beds. And they begin to create, and they create deities. So they create Lachmu and Lachamu. And then those two have Anshar and Kishar, An being sky or God, and the Ki being earth. And then Anshar and Kishar have Anu. See if I can remember all this. And then Anu has Ea, and then Ea has Marduk. Okay. And Damkina have Marduk. And there's no question that problems arise very, very quickly. So, for example, with the creation of these Anuna gods by Apsu and Tiamat, that noise, they start to make noise in the waters and whatever. And Apsu doesn't like that. He can't sleep. So he goes to Tiamat, and Tiamat says, these are our created children. We should bear with this disturbance. Apsu doesn't like that. His vizier Mumu says to him, hey, you should do something about this. You should kill them. You should destroy these gods. And so Apsu makes this plan. Well, then Ea learns of this plan, kills Apsu, and takes over his abode, right? Which is why Ea lives in the Apsu, the water table under the ground. Anyway, Marduk is then born to Ea and Damkina in the Apsu. I'm really proud of myself for being able to pull this out, by the way.
Yeah.
And Marduk is greater than all that have come before him, go figure. And Anu sees him, Anu's his grandfather, sees him and says, oh my gosh, he's got some grace. He's awesome. So gives him these 4 winds to play with. So Marduk starts playing with the 4 winds and roils up Tiamat, who is the sea. And now, ultimately what ends up happening is that Tiamat agrees to, destroy the gods. And so she creates these, 11 monsters that are really awful and venomous. And so now there's this second conflict, right? And Ea goes to Anshar, and Anshar says, you go and calm her down, fight her, whatever. Do what you got to do. And he goes out and he's too terrified, comes back, says, I can't, send somebody else. So Anu goes, his father. Anu comes back, same thing. Can't do it. No good. And so Marduk volunteers to go. With the condition that he gets made the senior god. He goes, he defeats her, cuts her up, creates heaven with half of her, creates the land as a dome for the Apsu, or a top for the covering for the Apsu. With the lower half of the body creates Tigris, Euphrates from her eyes and stuff. Anyway. And then ultimately man is created. It's Marduk who has the idea of it. Ea is the one that actually does it. And then mankind is there to, under the direction of, or the responsibility, whatever, of Marduk to feed the gods in their temples. So I don't know what he means by creation is a mistake. If the argument is that the gods are created and then they make a bunch of noise, and so one of the gods, Apsu, wants to kill him, and then he creates another god, or another god is born, and then Tiamat. Those are all gods. They're not humans that are the mistake. It may be that it's conflating it with Atrahasis, right, where humanity is created and in 1,200 years are not gone by and they're making all this noise from all the work that they're doing. Maybe that's what he's conflating it with, but I don't understand what he means by creation is a mistake there. And certainly it's not the case that there's no purpose.
Yeah, they're meant to serve the gods. And what are you meant for in the biblical? I was thinking about the Reformation and how I was in a Reformed tradition where we had the Westminster Confession, and it literally says the chief end of man is to worship you. Like, your number one goal is to serve and believe and worship God.
What's Adam in the garden for?
To till God's garden.
He's to work the ground, right? He's to work the garden for the deity. Like, Bruce Wells is writing a monograph on this and making a comparison to orchards utilized in Mesopotamia. But at any rate, the comparison of the worker of the orchard. But like, this is not so distinct. Or so, again, this isn't a question of, and again, I don't think Billy meant it, but if Billy meant that it's like a carbon copy, right? But he said it. He said that's not what he meant, right? But even it, like, that's not what's happening here. But that doesn't mean that there's no dependence, and it doesn't mean that there are no distinctions. Of course, there are distinctions. It's the whole fucking point.
I feel like this was a critique when Michael Jones came at me about my Dionysus video. He's like, dude, why are you even responding to this video? He thinks I was upset. No, I'm being very peculiar in dissecting his claims, and thought that he had arrogance when he said shut up and all this kind of stuff. Like, I was being very, very, you're this authority, you're going out here teaching these people, and I'm saying, no, I think you're wrong, and I'm making a critique, right? Well, in it, he couldn't understand why I did it, because he's like, the whole thing is about mythicist. You're not a mythicist. When 90% of what you're arguing against, you don't have to be a mythicist to say that that works. Like, you're actually arguing about things that I think cross over into my territory of things that I actually think are on the right track, or at least need to be better nuanced. That's what I feel somewhat happening here. And while we may not agree all with Billy, there's much we can stand and go, sorry, dude, I don't side with Wes on this. The other point that you bring out that I think is interesting, and this is something I see Genesis do, he mentioned 7 days, and it's ordered, and it's good, and it's from chaos to order, right? How often do the gods have a chaos situation happen, and then they bring order to the creation? I mean,
there's a Sumerian text called Enki in the world order. That's the whole point of the text, is that Enki brings order to the world. He says, this is your role. This is your role. This is what you're going to do. This is your role. This is your role. I think that's Chaos Kampf. This, like, this theme that you see throughout the mythological texts, and not just in Mesopotamia, but I mean, of course, you see it in elsewhere, is bringing often the sea as a divine figure, as a personified figure, into subjection through battle.
And is what you see in the even, I was about to say, is Yahweh not doing that over and over in the Psalms? I mean, it's all over. We had Leviathan we brought up earlier. There's Yam.
Think about Isaiah 27:1, right? Like, it's a loose quote, not that loose, from the Baal cycle. Like the twisting serpent, like this sort of thing. Again, I think that apologists, they worry too much about these connections. Some apologists worry too much about these connections, and they should just sort of like recognize it. But again, it sounds like Wes does, right? It sounds like Wes recognizes, but I don't know, maybe what happened is, as the discussion went on, it felt like recognizing Genesis 1 as an apologetic, polemic, whatever it is that he meant, would give too much ground. I'm not sure. Would have things that would follow from that, and so he started to kind of back off of it. I'm not sure. But, this final statement that he made in this clip about it's like you're sitting in an office, or you're sitting in a studio and I'm sitting in a studio, that doesn't mean that we're together. Yeah, that's not what's happening. Yeah, there's a recent publication, edited volume by Sophus Hella and Selena Wisnom, and I can't remember the other two editors. One, it's just entitled New English, or New English. And Eckhart Fromm has an article in there. And he, like, the whole point of the article is to just go through and show all of the places that Enuma Elish shows up outside of the cuneiform world, and inside and outside. And like the Enuma Elish is one of the most popular texts copied in scribal education contexts. Gasha showed that like back in like 2000. And, you know, he's citing occurrences or quotations or statements about the Enuma Elish that are clearly dependent upon, right, thinking about the Enuma Elish from like close to the 500 CE, right? So like there's nothing abnormal. And he has a whole section on Genesis 1 and its utilization of the Enuma Elish, or dependence upon the Enuma Elish. This is not a contested thing.
Even the whole, we've heard it a million times, is it ex nihilo? And it's like, when in the beginning, or thesis. It's literally started the same way as the Enuma Elish.
And I go through, I've been sort of, you know, holding back and going into too many details here to force you, but in the chapter that I have in the Atheist Handbook to the Old Testament, Volume 2, I have a whole chapter on the intertextuality that shows up between particularly ancient Near Eastern texts and Mesopotamian texts and Genesis 1 through 11. And we go into these things like we do in the course, right? These things about like the language that's used and what is it that's, how do scholars talk about this? So there's just this idea that we're having to push back and say, well, is studio, you're in a studio, I'm in a studio, like that's not what anybody's saying. No scholar is saying that there are just like these general parallels that show up everywhere else. No, there's clear dependency, clear dependence.
That is, there's so much when you pick apart everything Wes said that makes you go, hold on. And I'm sure that we have things we disagree with Billy on. Duh, of course, but like, it's that same thing. Like, I disagree with mythicists on the conclusion that Jesus didn't exist, but you're gonna catch me when I hear someone who's trying to tell you all of this actually happened and there's no parallels, and even if there were parallels, they don't do anything to dent our... Bro, get out of my face with that. You know what I'm saying? Like, there is a lot more to this.
Yeah. And to be clear, like, we obviously disagree with Billy on a lot of things. We obviously disagree with Wes on a lot of things, and we obviously agree with Billy on a lot of things, and we obviously agree with Wes on a lot of things, right, in this discussion. Right? And it's not like I'm uber familiar with both of their work outside of this debate, but I just think it's important to be even-handed here and to say, yeah, I think Wes is right on this. Yeah, I think Billy's right on this.
Yeah, and that's the problem is trying to nuance this.
Yeah, but I don't agree with that. I just see... if I have all these texts out, there's a lot of different information that you can see. There's a lot of it's been copied word for word into the biblical text. But
what's the word for word?
In your version of what you believe in, you keep saying that God's a he.
Yep.
And so where do you get that from?
Throughout both the Hebrew Old Testament and the Greek New Testament, you have the masculine singular pronoun used for God.
And why is God a man? Where's the evidence of this?
Well, God isn't a man. See, within historical Christianity, we don't believe that God has a gender. However, the way that he has decided to reveal himself is through the masculine plural, and then ultimately by becoming a human in the person of Jesus Christ. So we don't believe that God has a gender. In fact, the fact that God creates humanity in his image and he creates them male and female, those are two aspects of the image of God. And so that's the completeness.
I mean, there's so much, to say, and I don't want us to get bogged down into every little nut and bolt, but I will say this. God made man first, right? According to the myth. And then out of the man, he then makes the woman. And why? And is there any other rib stories? Anyway, I'm just being, but yeah, I mean, look,
again, we've said this before. If we're just speaking like it sounds like Wes is through the lens of historical Christianity, be careful about that. Fine. Like no problem here, because that's an interpretive framework, and that's the interpretive framework that is going to see Satan in Genesis 3, right? But if we're asking the question, how does the Hebrew Bible portray the deity? Portrays him as a man, like as a male,
right?
And Ted Lewis has a volume of recent, 2020 I think is when it came out, 2020, 2021, the Origin of Character of God. And, he has like a long section of this, right? Like they're not shy. The writers of the Hebrew Bible are not shy about talking about God's body, right? And describing him as male. Like and again, I think Wes is agreeing with that, right? The masculine pronoun it sounds like what he's saying, and I'm guessing that's where he's going with that. So again, like I don't think that's the issue, but it sounds like what Billy is saying is like, why should we?
Yeah, he's challenging the he's not getting in the weeds with Wes about this, but he is challenging like why? Why is he calling him? Well, God decided, it's this interpretive lens again. God decided to reveal himself through this kind of pronoun, but then his apologetic why is that he made both male and female in his image, which meant God is both feminine and male here in this text. But even then, does Wes really think that God, like in his interpretive model, they look like God? Because we get down into the actual original context, they look like the God.
Yeah, and I don't think anybody's going to make the argument that like you see descriptions of El or Baal or Enlil, right? That they're going to have any problem coming away thinking it's male deity,
Right.
And
Or Marduk or
so either Yahweh, I think, is very clearly being portrayed as a male deity.
he's a man of war.
That's right. So
Now, I know we could find feminine attributes in scripture, and I know Francesca Staropoulos in her book God and Anatomy, she covers some of these things, and I think her interpretation of the data, because she's trying to do it from a historical, not a faith-based perspective, but a historical one, is something in the lines of like, when his consort is no longer by his side, he has to kind of fill in those gaps in some ways, in some of the text of being both the mother and father. Because where's the mother goddess? She's not in the text anymore. She's no longer part of the pantheon. How is it going to handle that? Well, he's also being the single dad in a way, who's also being the mom and the dad. I don't know what the total, like, if we can ever know exactly how to understand this, but as you pointed out, as the priestly text is distancing God from the people, he's becoming a little more ethereal as well in some of his manifestation. An angel of the Lord is appearing instead of him. Like, once you start recognizing these layers, it becomes obvious that the older you go, just like we were talking about earlier interpretations of Mesopotamia, it was no problem for Enlil to be evil. He did bad, or a god to die. Like, they died all the time when you go way, way back there. It's like, I don't know.
And I think there's this underlying assumption of univocality in these, and understandably so, because if Wes is coming at this from like historical Christian theology, there's an assumption of univocality in the text. But again, if we're going from a historical critical perspective, there isn't this univocal, there's this heterogeneous voice, right?
I can apply.
I'm sorry, gotta cut that, but it's not heterogeneous, homogeneous. There's not this univocality. There isn't this single theological position in the Hebrew Bible. And I think that that's something that we need to highlight in this type of discussion. We're talking about the interpretive model of historical Christianity. Fine. You can have this univocality, this homogeneity. But talking about historical critical, you just don't have that univocality.
You know, my problem is I've been reading all sorts of stuff in like broad, there's so many different categories. I got lost in recently in classical material, but before that I did the God's body stuff, and I was like, you know what, let me do another one. People really liked the Francesca one. Let me defend Francesca by using other scholars, so she's not the lone wolf out here speaking on behalf of God's body, God having a male body. And Benjamin's Stone? His book, there's a female academic that actually had a really good one that goes deep into this too. And then there's like 3 or 4 different books that I can't remember the names off the top of my head. One of the very first things the guy goes is, just so you know, again, the univocal, the Bible's not talking about one Yahweh. Yahweh is more than one Yahweh, and the way Yahweh is portrayed or visualized or understood is unique and different. Adding to that, some of the interesting aspects is the female academic who actually takes us through going into the language and art of the surrounding ancient Near Eastern cultures, showing you that in their texts, they describe the gods in a certain way. Then they show the images of the gods, whether it's Egypt with hieroglyphics, they show the visuals. Then they're showing coinage of El right there in Ugarit in Israel and how he's depicted. Then they're showing this and this. Like, so what they do, in a nutshell, dumbing this down so bad, because it's like chapters of this. It's so dense and very, very important if you want to understand. Practically this, the language that depicts humans and the art that depicts humans is also the same language that is used for the gods, and the art that depicts the gods in an anthropomorphic, bodily, physical form like us. The same language that depicts God in the Bible is the same language that is used to depict man in the Bible, and the art that we find also is depicting the same thing. The conclusion is God has a body and it's male. It's that simple. That was the conclusion. And all of these academics from they had differences in their books, came to the same conclusion. Now I know later on, I would argue post-Plato, Greek philosophy starts to infiltrate all the minds and Hellenism. Yeah, we get it. But that's the lens you're interpreting it through now, and it's not what the original text were indicating.
And as long as we're clear about the distinction,
I understand what you're saying, Mark, but what I'm saying is I think we're missing a big point here. The point that I'm trying to make here is that the Bible is written by people, men who are extremely flawed. And the evidence of that is what they took the information that's in that biblical text and what they did with it globally to other human beings, and how they even wrote about it in the Bible, how they enslaved and tortured people in the biblical text. So in that case, even in the book of Deuteronomy, which is one of the most brutal books out there, where everything is given okay to rape women, kill children. If one person talks against your Lord, go to that town and kill the whole town, burn the town down.
So brutal.
It's just too much. Like I said,
so this is another place that I think we have to be very clear in the context of these discussions when we're talking about what an ancient writer meant or said. And what I mean by that, there are different categories. There's an emic category and an etic category. And basically the distinction here is, what did it mean in its context, to its writer, to its audience? And what does it mean through a more modern lens, right? That's the sort of the big distinction here. So when we think about passages like Deuteronomy 21, which is the law about the captive bride, Deuteronomy 21, 10-14, today, looking back, and this is setting aside just marriage in general in the ancient world, where consent isn't really a thing. When you think about the captive bride, I don't think there's any modern definition that I know of, not that it's my field, but I don't know of any modern definition that would not be considered rape, right? It's sex under duress without consent. Like, that's rape, right?
Right.
And yet we have to be very careful, because I don't think we can say, without nuancing it, without explaining what we mean, that Deuteronomy 21 endorsed rape. If what we mean is, when we look at it through our modern understanding of what consent is and what rape would be, it is endorsing that act that we would call rape.
Right.
Yes, 100%, no question about it. In this kind of a context, though, where we've been dealing with what did the ancient authors mean, or what did the audience hear, this historical critical context. I think if we're going to say something like Deuteronomy endorsed rape or condoned rape or said it was perfectly okay, I can't remember the verbiage that he used exactly, they would not have considered that rape.
Right.
So there are laws in Deuteronomy 22 against rape, right? So we can't say that from their lights, according to their lights,
Is it because in that context, it's a battle, it's a war, like we won, we defeated you, we now take your women. It's kind of like the given as part of a war, like the war booty. Sure, they're property. They're property.
Yeah.
Now, the condemnation of the act that gets in the next chapter, you're saying that's a completely different context. Is that talking about married women? Is that talking about just any woman in a free society? Like they're not slaves, but they're...
So there are different categories that are laid out in Deuteronomy 22. I have a whole chapter for this in that same atheist handbook to the Old Testament. But yes, so the question that always comes up with something like rape, laws against rape, are whether the woman assented to it. It's different from our conception of rape. Did she put up a struggle? Like, was she voluntarily going and doing that?
Right.
And again, not to get into the weeds here, but then her status. Is she
a slave?
A free virgin?
Right.
Is she a betrothed or already married woman? Or is she a slave? Like, these are all categories, things that can affect that. But the point is that when Billy says here that it says it's perfectly fine to rape or something like that, that's true if what he means is according to our lights.
If Wes can use his interpretation model all day long in a Bible, and he does all throughout this thing, like, well, according to the Christian interpreter, well, we think it's the image of God. All of that is disputed according to historical rigorous, what's the text saying in its original context. Cool. You got your chance to spit your views on what you thought. Well, according to our views, and I would imagine Wes would feel this way himself if that kind of behavior was happening right now. So it's just ironic that when we get to the Bible, there's these, like, let's defend, let's protect, let's shift the goalposts. That's kind of...
Yeah, I mean, I don't think any apologist, not any, but many apologists that I engage with, they wouldn't balk at saying the Neo-Assyrians murdered, like the Neo-Assyrians kings murdered, their captives after war, right?
Right.
But that's not according to the Neo-Assyrian lights, they're not murdering them. So I think, we're all guilty of doing this sort of thing or being prone to doing this sort of thing. But that's why I think we just need to be precise here. So, like, again, I agree with what Billy is saying here. If what he's saying is that according to our lights, this text, and I think that is what he's saying because he's talking about how the text was used.
Yeah.
But according to our lights, there's no question that was non-consensual, forcible sex.
Well, yeah, and this doesn't even get into the conquest because but it's related to, I think, his point of go and take, and these are virgin daughters and virgin girls and all that. So that's a whole nother can of worms.
And just to speak very briefly to the slavery issue, I mean, Leviticus 25 condemns by death the man stealing. So stealing someone and selling them into slavery. And the fact that the 10 Commandments are prefaced with, you are a nation who was slaves. I'm the God of Israel who brought you out of Egypt. So there's a fundamental difference, and there's lots of literature on this. I would encourage people to read my friend Paul Copan's book, Is God a Moral Monster? He's written some excellent stuff. He's also written on Did God Command Genocide in the Old Testament? He's a leading expert in the field of a comparative analysis of ancient Near Eastern war literature. And so there are very coherent explanations.
Unpacking that 42 seconds, there's so much shit in there, honestly. Just being honest, Josh.
All right. So I want to talk about two primary things here. First, this is an example of being gracious to our opponent, right? So, once Wes starts talking about slavery in the Hebrew Bible, he becomes my opponent. Right? I'm just half kidding there. But so here, if I were a dick, I would say,
just be a dick right now. Just
no, but when Wes said, "Can you summarize the Enuma Elish?"
Right.
Well, what Wes did here, I feel like it would be very easy for me to take his slip up and say, "You don't even know these passages," because he said in Leviticus 25, there's this law about man stealing. Well, that's Exodus 21:16, right? Or Deuteronomy 24:7, right? But that's just a slip up.
Right.
And it doesn't mean that he doesn't know these passages. It doesn't mean that he doesn't know the text.
But even that, what does that have anything to do with slave ultimately?
But I want to bring that out because I think it's important that, again, while there may be contexts in which it's necessary to have that type of rhetoric,
Yeah.
I feel like we should be reticent to do it. Here, I am giving Wes the benefit of the doubt here that he knows that that's Exodus 21:16. If he took a second to think, he'd be like, oh yeah, that's right, it's Exodus. Because he started to say Exodus, right? And then he changed it to Leviticus 25. So I don't think that's indicative of him not knowing these passages.
Okay.
Okay, you're absolutely right.
Man stealing has no bearing on the system of slavery that is being endorsed in the.
Of course.
And what is man stealing? So people understand it's not you can't own people and make them your property. It's you got a guy who's mine, pretend I own a slave and you own a slave, and I go and steal your slave or keep him or go off and sell him. That's against the law.
Sure.
Or stealing another person's slave.
Sure.
Or free person, correct?
Yeah. I mean, and the example that I give is it's illegal to steal somebody's car. That doesn't mean you can't own a car.
Right.
So, right, I mean, like, duh. So, two or three or 50 things that I could say about this. Oh, first, there's a law. There are laws in the ancient Near East against stealing people, right? Would Wes argue that because Codex Hammurabi, the laws of Hammurabi 14, make it you can't, steal somebody's kid or forcement of slavery, that therefore there's no slavery? Nah.
Or that the Code of Hammurabi is divine.
Yeah, it's a better, right? Yeah, no, of course not, right? Nor should. And so, but the reality here is you're not allowed to reduce a free person to the status of slave against their will like that. You can't kidnap people. Like that has nothing to do with slavery. In the sense that it's not like if you can't kidnap people, there's no social institution of slavery. That doesn't make any sense.
Right.
It doesn't follow from that, and which is evidence simply in the chapter itself, right? So now I know that they want to make big distinctions about it's not chattel slavery, it's indentured servitude. It absolutely is chattel slavery, and you and I have talked about this ad nauseum. I don't know if you want to go into it here, but just to sort of camp on the point that he made there about Paul Copan, and this to me is a red flag. When you cite Paul Copan as an expert, how did he word it?
Encourage people to read my friend Paul Copan's book, Is God a Moral Monster? He's written some excellent stuff. He's also written on Did God Command Genocide in the Old Testament? He's a leading expert in the field of a comparative analysis of ancient Near Eastern war literature. And so there are very coherent explanations.
Okay, so he's a leading expert in the field of comparative analysis of ancient Near Eastern war literature.
Right.
Okay. No, he's not. And I think if you ask Paul, with whom I've had conversations, if you were to ask Paul, I've gone back and forth with him in writing.
Yeah.
Blog, whatever, responses to one another. I wrote an article in the Misusing Scripture edited volume from Religion. He responded to it. And anyway, but if you were to ask Paul, are you a leading expert in the field of comparative ancient Near Eastern war literature? He would say, no, I'm a philosopher. He relies on the work of people like Lawson Younger, who had a 1991 dissertation on the conquest and its ties to ancient Near Eastern war rhetoric. So looking at people like Sennacherib from his third, there's all kinds of the Hittite rulers. There's all kinds of people that he makes comparisons to, for a very specific reason, by the way. Who's also building on the work of Mario Liveronid, right? So, but the point is that so I would encourage people to read other people from Paul Copan. So if people are interested in looking at the topic of slavery, I would encourage the edited volume put together by Raymond Westbrook, which is I think like Ancient Near Eastern Law. I can never remember titles of books, but it's just this very popular 2-volume series on ancient Near Eastern law. And he's brought together experts from all over, from the various ancient Near Eastern geographical regions and periods, and each of them have a section on slavery in their respective periods under discussion. Of course, Samuel Gringus has a phenomenal volume on this, on laws in the ancient Near East and how they track, or in the Hebrew Bible, and how they track from the ancient Near East down to rabbinic times. Gregory Kirikinyo has a volume. Sorry, there's a lot of work out there on slavery. I've read a couple books on it myself. So if you are interested in that, did the Old Testament endorse slavery? The one reason that I would suggest maybe look at that is I have an extensive bibliography.
It covers all these sources and more you're not even going to remember.
Yeah.
But I also recommend it because it's easy for people to read compared to some of the rigorous tomes that you're going to source in your bibliography. And if you're looking for something to understand, plus it's on Audible, right?
That's correct.
So yeah, you can just listen to it right now. I'll put the link in the description.
And there's a chapter that the one advantage that I guess my book has in this regard is that there's a whole chapter and 2 appendices, huge appendices, comparing the laws in the ancient Near East specifically about slavery to the laws in the Hebrew Bible about slavery. And what you'll find when you view these is that sometimes they're a little bit better from our vantage point. At times morally they're a little bit better. Sometimes they're a little bit worse. But on the whole, just like with rape and adultery laws,
right,
they're just on par. They're what you would expect to find in the ancient Near East. So I think that it's a red flag to me that Wes is citing Paul Copan as an expert in this. I suspect the reason that he is citing him is because he's written several books from an apologetic point of view about this topic, because God, a Moral Monster is probably the more famous one, or the more well-known one, where he's going through systematically and addressing all these sort of like really problematic topics, slavery, genocide, whatever. I think he does so in a way that is not above critique. And I would just recommend that people read actual specialists in the field on this topic.
Yeah. I mean, if you have a philosophy or a particular apologetic, you're going to work overtime to make that work. And I've seen it happen. You made me think about the state of the field. And like, do we have this problem with people disputing the ethics on this level in the Enuma Elish or the Atrahasis epic or in Gilgamesh epic? No, this is the only field that I know of that's dealing with ancient literature on this level where, you do have it. I know from talking to early critical scholars in Islam, you get the same mess of watch what you say, watch how you interpret, or you're going to get those emails. You're going to get those threats from other academics going, hey, this is not in line. And you're signing faith waivers to go to some of these schools to have certain ideas that you can only push. I mean, this is a problem I find. And anyway, I want to make one more comment that I saw him say, and I thought about all the years I read the Bible. Like, I read the Bible. I know that sounds funny to you, Josh. You're like, dude, I've read the Bible too. What are you getting at, D? I seriously believe that 95 to 98% of Christians have never read their entire Bible. Okay? Really never read their Bible. And I'm not saying Wes didn't. I'm not saying that at all. Okay? But Wes made a statement that God brought them out of slavery. And I don't know about you, bro, but if you remember the story, God made them slaves in Egypt. According to their theological outlook and the biblical text, he puts them into slavery in Egypt, and then he draws them out, freeing them. He's the one who does all this. So like, it ain't a, yeah, my God freed us. Yeah, he put you there for 400 years or more, like according to your own story.
And when he brought them out, in this chapter that he references, Leviticus 25, he says, you can no longer make Israelite slaves. Why? Because they are my slaves. And this is the problem that I see with Christian apologetics in this vein. And again, I've only heard Wes say a couple of things about this, so I don't know what his position would be. though I can probably guess. If I were to say, start where Wes did and say, you're not allowed to mistreat. Remember, you were slaves in Egypt. I brought you out of Egypt. I would carry it further, right? Look at Leviticus 19, 33 and 34. Like, you're supposed to love foreigners, love them as yourselves, right? Care for them. Look at the book of Ruth and look at how Boaz is caring for the allowed to glean. All of these things, right? There's so many ties. It's love the foreigner, love the widow, love the orphan. And so I paint this broad backdrop. Don't oppress the foreigner. So now when I get to a passage like Leviticus 25, 44 to 46, if we actually do get there in the discussion, when it says, as for male and female slaves whom you may have, you may purchase them from the nations around you. From them you may buy slaves. You may also purchase some of the temporary residents that are living in the land with you, and from their families who have been born in your land. They will become your property. You may pass them on as inheritance to your children after you. You may make them serve forever. But as for the fellow Israelites, you are not allowed to rule over them with ruthlessness, or whatever we're translating the word parach there. Now, hopefully, I've painted this broad back where you're thinking, well, wait a minute, I'm not supposed to oppress the foreigner. Right. So it can't be that kind of slavery. The problem is, one, that if I were to go back to the law collections of Hammurabi, or the law collections of Ornana, or the law collections of Ishtar, or so many of these ancient kings, their role in Mesopotamia is to care for the oppressed, for the vulnerable, for the weak, for the widow, for the orphan, for the poor are supposed to be cared for and not allowed to be oppressed by the rich. And if I were to paint that broad picture, then go to the laws in Hammurabi, you wouldn't say, oh gosh, man, it can't really be slavery, man. You're supposed to protect the vulnerable. Oh, what's happening? So here's the reality about slavery in a nutshell. I know you and I have talked about this so much, but just so that it's here. In Exodus 21 and Deuteronomy 15, Israelites are allowed to be taken as debt slaves and kept for up to 6 years, have to be released in the seventh. In Exodus 21, 2-6, it specifies that if an Israelite comes in single and is given a wife by his master, who is a slave, not the master of the wife, the woman, and they have children, when that man's term of service is up, the 6 years, and he wants to exercise his right to go free, his wife and his children do not go with him. They belong to the master. If the husband wants to stay with them, he becomes a chattel slave. So you have 3 types of chattel slaves there, right? Or three different chattel slaves in that scenario. The man who signs up to be one, and the wife and the children that are chattel slaves. They're the property of the owner. Slaves are anticipated to be beaten. These are probably debt slaves, most likely debt slaves in Exodus 21, 20 to 21, 26 to 27. If a slave is beaten, and it's determined, that's probably what's going on here, it's determined that they've been killed via abuse, then the master is to be killed, probably killed. It's a difficult word there to talk about the context, but if they survive a day or two, then there is to be no punishment, no because the is silver, right? This is money. And we've talked about this ad nauseum in different places. In 26 and 27, if a slave has an eye destroyed or a tooth knocked out, which are serious offenses in the ancient Near East, right? These are things that drew serious penalties, even from very early on. The slave does not do lex talionis, which a free person would be. Instead, they are to be released because they're a debt slave, again, most likely in the context there, and their debt is forgiven and they're released, right? Which essentially equates to a monetary payment. This is what we see for the slave who is most likely a chattel slave in Exodus 21:32. If he's gored to death, then the 30 shekel payment is made to his master to compensate to buy a new slave, ostensibly. This is
disposable in a way, but yeah.
Their property, their valuable property. 30 shekels is nothing to sneeze at, but they're valuable property, but they're property nonetheless. Deuteronomy 15 has a lot of parallels to that, so we won't go to that. But Leviticus 25 is the other place that really hones in on foreign slaves. Foreign slaves, by the time of the Holiness Code, are, again, as I recited there, they're allowed to be purchased as permanent property. They become part of the inheritance that's passed down. They become part of the achuzah. There in the Hebrew, the landed property that is, the inheritance that is passed down. They can go to their children. They're allowed to be, made to serve forever. So these are chattel slaves, the slaves proper in this sense. So this is what slavery was like. Okay. Now, if people want to talk about how this compares to what's going on again in the rest of the ancient Near East, again, I would encourage them you could read Bible on it, or you can read any number of sources on this. And again, there's not a lot to distinguish them
for these things, and that slavery within ancient Israel was very, very different from what slavery around the ancient Near East was like. And on top of that, once again, when abolition movements happen, what's that? Sorry, Billy?
I said slavery continued on throughout the Bible with no problems.
But it was always undergirded by the fact that this was not the ideal, that this was something that should not be done. And even slavery within ancient Israel was fundamentally different than slavery around the ancient Near East. This is not a contested fact. You can look at the scholarship of individuals like Wright, who's written extensively on this. He's an ancient Near Eastern ethicist. And there's vast difference between the law codes in Leviticus, Deuteronomy, and Numbers, and something like the Code of Hammurabi, which puts people on a tier system and gives different punishments depending on where they are within society. That's not true in ancient Israel. If you were a king and you stole somebody and you sold them into slavery, they would punish you by death.
But you steal somebody else's slave. You can't steal somebody else's slave. That's not a good thing to do, right?
No, we've talked about several of the things that he discussed there, but to again pick up on who he is citing as an expert in this, he's citing Christopher Wright, who has written a book on Old Testament ethics, ancient Near Eastern Old Testament ethics, with whom I disagree on many points. But the idea that it's not a contested fact that slavery in Israel is vastly different is just a nonsense statement. It's incorrect. It is incorrect. And again, when I did, I had a discussion, Kip Davis and I had a discussion with Gavin Ortland and Trent Hoare.
Mm-hmm. I hosted it.
That's right. Yeah. And my memory is bad. As I guess that's why I'm here, and I'm your savior. The basic argument that they were making was that, yes, slavery was there and it was bad, but it was a little bit better than the rest of the ancient Near East. And so there were things that they brought up, Exodus 21, 26, 27. There were some contentious things in the debate that, we couldn't see eye to eye on. But, part of the issue here is trying to find, from the apologist standpoint, trying to find these things that are so much better about what's in the Hebrew Bible. So you notice that what I heard Wes say was that there's a tiered system in the Code of Hammurabi.
Right.
Okay, so what he's referring to is there are three different types of people that are referred to. There's an awilim, which is like a free person, whatever, regular citizen type person. You have a mushkanim, which is like a commoner. And then you have a wardum, which is a slave. And so you'll see a lot of these laws. If you knock out the eye, have an awilim, eye for eye. If you knock out the eye of a mushkanim, a commoner, slightly less penalty. If you knock out the eye of a slave, less penalty, right? So this tiered system is what he's saying does not exist in the Hebrew Bible, as we talked about in the last clip. While it's true that there's not a three-tiered system that's, laid out in the law collections of the Hebrew Bible, there's certainly a distinction between a punishment that happens to a free person and punishment that happens to the master if the ox gores a free person, if the ox gores a slave. One is a monetary penalty and one is the life is forfeit. So, again, receipts is what I'll need to see here. And again, Christopher Wright's book, again, I don't think that I would consider him to be a specialist. I can't remember what he got his PhD in, but certainly I don't think that his work is one that I think is, it's not one that I would rely on, shall we say. And, Bernard Jackson has a phenomenal quote, I cited in my book, but he has a phenomenal quote about this specific point of contention about how the ancient Near East block elections are so much worse than what you see in the Hebrew Bible. And he cites, I think it's Hammurabi 117. It's one that I talk about quite a bit, where it says if someone becomes a debt slave, they're allowed to be kept for 3 years, and they have to be released in the 4th. So I remember asking the question in that discussion, is it better to be a debt slave for a longer period of time or a shorter period of time? And if you say, well, it's definitely better to be, a slave for a shorter period of time, well, then the laws of Hammurabi are better than what you see in the Hebrew Bible.
Yeah.
And then if you take the other horn and you say, well, no, it must be better than to be a slave for a longer period of time, then I would say, oh, well, God really didn't like his own people then, because gosh, those foreign slaves had it real good. They were allowed to be kept for life and passed on as inheritance.
Right. And the reverse is what I noticed the apologists do, where as soon as you brought up that it's actually a lot less time that they're slaves, half the amount of time in this context, specifically the 6 years for Israelites and 3 years here with the Hammurabi Code. To me, it was really interesting to watch their brains immediately find a way to rationalize that and go, actually, well, in the ancient world, it was hard to survive. And so if we could stay longer in the slave's house, it was better for the survival rate. They made excuses about this insanity.
Imagine what you would hear if Exodus 21:2 said, you may keep them for 3 years and release them in the 4th. And Hammurabi 117 said you can keep them for 6. They would use that. That's all you'd hear about. Yep, all day long. Look, it's twice as good.
Yeah. And this is why I'm in trouble always psychoanalyzing, because I know what goes into the brain of this. I thought it was funny at the end how Billy was like, yeah, I guess it's not good to steal your friend's slave, and he chuckles. I mean, Billy sees it. Billy's seeing it while he's going on and on about it. And you're the guy on the slavery, the ancient Near East, you understand these earlier myths. And so as we're wrapping up this entire episode, I would just say to anyone who's caught up in this whole debacle of going against Billy, chill. You don't have to agree with Billy. Billy, we've talked to him. We don't agree with Billy's conclusions. He's not that kind of guy where you have to believe like me and agree with me on everything. But also, I want you to think about the worldview you hold and the man that you so value as the center of that philosophy. His name is Jesus. And I think it was Gandhi who once said, I love your Christ, but I can't stand your Christians. And I really wish more Christians acted like Christ, especially right now, when this is a person who went on record in that debate to say, I believe in God, but he had his problems with the text and stuff. And then the hate that this guy has been getting and the kind of bullying bullshit that the internet is doing on him on this level. This is why I've been clapping back a little. Of course, I'm critical of apologists, but I was also raised to try and stand up for people, no matter what the circumstance ultimately is in this, to kind of stand up and be like, this isn't right. This isn't right. You can do a hit piece, do a critique, criticize what Billy's saying, but the level that it's gone to, I mean, I was guilty of it initially. And I realized, hold on, there's a human being behind this that's getting really treated in a way that would Jesus ever do that? I mean, not the idealized form of Jesus they have in mind. I could find some pretty horrific stuff in the New Testament Jesus said. I mean, we can get picky, but I know the kind of Christ that I had in mind as a Christian who is unattainable and perfect. And you are not even acting like that. So many people are not realizing Billy needs your prayer. Billy needs your love. I'm just making the point.
Sure, yeah.
To kind of paint the context. Billy needs you guys to go and not treat him like this. Show him love, unconditional love. Don't do that. That's my personal advice. Why is it a skeptic? Why is it two skeptics are here showing compassion to somebody that we don't agree with at the end of the day? We can agree on the facts of these things. Why aren't y'all extending the same kind of compassion? It bothers me, especially when you know some of the things that Billy was saying that they're saying to him. Man, it's messed up, bro. And you and me heard it the other night, and it really offends me to hear that some of the stuff that, was being said to him. So